All right, y'all. Today we're talking about Dark Knight Returns. This is one of the most important Batman comics ever published. It was written and drawn by Frank Miller. Klaus Janson did the coloring. It was originally released as a four-part miniseries in 1986. It was collected into a combined issue the same year. You'll notice that each of the books, it's got 4 books inside of it, has a different title. When it was published originally as 4 separate comics, they had all different titles, but when it was collected together, it was just called The Dark Knight Returns. It starts out with Bruce Wayne as an aged man. He's 55 years old. He has been retired for about 10 years. He retires following the death of Robin, a character named Jason Todd. And the novel really explores Batman's psychology. It explores the relationships between Batman and his rogues gallery, people like Harvey Dent, Joker, and even Superman, as we will find. And this novel was also the direct influence for many subsequent films. There is a cartoon version of The Dark Knight Returns, surprisingly, given its content. You may remember the 2016 film Batman v Superman, or you may have put it out of your memory if you saw it. And you may have saw the 2019 film The Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. Both of those films take direct influence from this comic, and it is widely regarded by comic scholars as one of the greatest Batman stories ever told, and it's also widely criticized too. We'll talk about both of those things. So the background and execution, it's not exactly canon. That is, it's not fully integrated into the DC universe. It is a kind of standalone thing that happens kind of outside continuity, what's called Earth 31. What DC did was to account for all the different kind of versions of Batman, all the different things that happened to Batman and the various comic book heroes over the years, as they postulated a universe where there was multiple Earths, and that each of the Batmans inhabits a kind of different Earth, and that accounts for why Batman might die in one story, but he's back in another, why he might have a child in one storyline, but not in others, is that there's different Earths. So this one's called Earth 31. When this came out in '86, there certainly had been serious superhero comics published before. I'm thinking of work of Chris Claremont on X-Men, for example, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams on Batman, and other DC comics were gritty and had some degree of realism. But mainly Batman was associated in this period with the kind of campier Adam West era Batman. I'd encourage you, if you don't know what Adam West is or who he is to go to YouTube and just type in Adam West Batman and watch a few clips, watch the whole show, watch everything. It's awesome. But when Miller created this darker, grittier Batman, what he was interested in, I think, was responding to those campier Batmans, to those earlier Batmans that were less serious, that were kind of divorced from real-life social issues that Dark Knight Returns will kind of take up in serious ways, like the nature of vigilantism, the effects that Batman has on communities around him, the fact that there are lots of deaths that come when you are a one-man vigilante army, kind of, that Batman is. There's things that the comic's aware of that Miller's exploring, and that's something else that I think is important about this comic, is that it's not just celebrating Batman, but instead it's also critiquing this kind of model of heroism. So as you read, you might pay attention to the moments that Batman is brutal, that but also the ways in which he kind of changes and grows throughout the comic, if you believe that he does. The format is a 16-panel grid, it's called. We talked about this in the other video, but you can really see it here, is that the pages are just full, and they are brimming with not only images and panels, but also words. So it takes some time to read and some time to get used to the kind of flow of the comic. When you'll see when we get further in the semester is more recent comics writers have kind of moved away from this strict panel organization, this kind of 4 by 4 by 4 by 4, and instead are embracing less linear storytelling models. But just kind of be aware that this is one way that particularly earlier comics kind of did it. And when we read Watchmen next week, keep in mind how Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons does it for that. The timeline is that this takes place in 1986 during the Reagan presidency. As I said, Batman is now 55 years old. He has been retired for 10 years, and Gotham kind of broadly stands in for New York City. You'll see a lot of references to the Twin Towers, which, of course, in 86, when this was written, We're still standing, unfortunately. And one of the things that you'll notice too is that this is a kind of pre-internet era. This is before you had widespread access to information like we do now. So the primary way that people would get their information was via newspapers or news reporters. So the news reporter and the kind of talking heads, the various kind of public experts, were a much bigger part of life in the 80s than they perhaps are now. So that's something, a feature in the text to keep track of. So when we get people like Dr. Wolper, who is an anti-Batman psychiatrist, he's supposed to kind of stand in for one portion of the population that feels this way. So we have Wolper, who is one person, but I think what Miller's trying to communicate is that there's lots of people who feel that way, and it's just given kind of voice through this particular person. So keep that in mind in the way that the talking heads kind of frame the conversations about Batman's morality, for example, any of the big thematic concerns, and they also comment on that pretty substantially. There were other Robins, but Batman's almost always had a Robin since 1940. The original one was the OG Robin was Dick Grayson, and then Jason Todd came around in 1983. Todd dies in the line of duty, according to Dark Knight Returns, but Miller doesn't exactly explain how until he writes another comic in 2016. There's several follow-ups to Dark Knight Returns that are of various quality. When Miller does explain how Todd dies, he was killed by the Joker's men, and his death, as I said, is why Batman retires. And then we get this kind of introspective, also naked Batman, who is thinking about why it is that he retired. He's kind of drawn back to his past as part of this eternal return we'll talk about in a second. But we can see here, he says, I will not let him, I gave my word for Jason, never, never again. Right? So we can see that he's kind of haunted by his former sidekick and the death of that sidekick that he feels responsible for. So this starts off, the novel starts off with Bruce Wayne kind of thinking about what would be a good life and a good death. And you'll notice throughout the comic that he returns to this idea of what is a good life. Batman's origin story is that his parents die violently outside of a theater, that they are seeing a production of Zorro, and they leave early for whatever reason, and then they are mugged, and during the mugging, his parents are killed. And almost all superheroes have some sort of origin story, and they're almost all traumatic. So superhero stories are very trope heavy in a lot of ways, and this traumatic origin story means that there's a lot of violence throughout almost all superhero stories, and violence becomes a way of not only initiating this hero's life into a kind of life of crime fighting, but also the way that the heroes tend to resolve crime fighting. Or resolve their issues. So this origin story also kind of creates a cycle, what the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche calls eternal return. And the idea of the eternal return is that you're always kind of drawn back to this important moment, this important kind of time that gives birth to you as a person in certain ways. And we see this throughout the novel when Bruce literally comes back to the spot in which his parents were killed. We see that early in the novel when he's underneath the streetlight, for example. He comes back to it later when he's thinking about going back into the life of crime fighting. He says something about if it was revenge or after you took it 40 years ago. So this is something that clearly is a huge motivator for Batman. But one of the things that Nietzsche says, and I'll kind of summarize this for you, is that the eternal return is the idea that if you lived a year of your life, let's say in high school or something like that, would you be comfortable living that over and over and over again? And the question really becomes is that, did you live a fulfilling, authentic life? Did you do the things you were supposed to do? Did you live virtuously? Did you live with kind of strength and power? And if your answer is no, then you have to return to that part of your life over and over again to kind of work through it. And I think clearly for Bruce, the answer is no, that he's unhappy with his life, right? So at the beginning of the novel, he's drinking too much, he's going into car chases and car wrecks and almost killing himself with that. He's not living authentically, and he's really unhappy with what he's done in response to his parents' death and what he's kind of let happen to the city that he cares about. So this kind of eternal return is one way to explain the way that superheroes are motivated by that original trauma, by that trauma that compels them into their life path. Batman's Rogues Gallery in this book, the book is divided, of course, into four smaller books, but there really are three major enemies. The first is Two-Face, or Harvey Dent, which we get in book 1. Then he goes against the mutant leader in book 2. That's not a classical part of his Rogues Gallery. That's something that Miller innovated for this particular comic, as far as I know. In book 3, we get the Joker, and if you remember the scene in the Joker film where Robert De Niro's character is the talk show host, that's clearly, I think, derived from the David Endocrine show in this. And then the Batman v Superman takes its kind of basis from book 4 of Dark Knight Returns. And through these Rogues Gallery, if you remember, I'll talk about Joker for just a second, that he's comatose for the decade that Batman is inactive. And as soon as Batman comes back into the forefront, he takes his public persona back. Joker sees that on TV and wakes up. So there's a really interesting idea, the way that Batman and his Rogues Gallery live in some sort of symbiotic relationship, that the one can't live without the other, and that their actions are kind of ping-pong back and forth off of each other, and that without Batman we really wouldn't have a Joker, and vice versa. And that becomes a area of pretty strong debate among the talking heads, is particularly Walper ascribes the existence of Batman's nemesis to Batman's crusading kind of spirit. And then we got the novel begins and ends with references to a good life and a good death. And this reminds me of the concept from Greek philosophy called eudaimonia, which literally means a good daemon or a good spirit. You're lucky. It's the good life. It's happiness. Eudaimonia is a Greek term, and for Aristotle, it means that you're living a life of virtue. You're not in excess. You're not deficient. For Aristotle, virtue is the kind of to have the virtue of honesty means you're not overly honest and hurting people's feelings. It means you're not lying, but it means you're like in that perfect kind of middle ground. And I think that's something that Bruce really struggles with throughout throughout the text, is knowing what the right thing to do is. Right, he starts out the text brutally fighting physically against the bad guys. He cripples people. He hurts them really badly. But by the end of the text, he seems to be much less brutal. He seems to have grown and changed, in my estimation, at least. We get that final scene where he says this will be a good life, good enough, and he's training up Carrie Kelly and the Sons of Batman in order to be the next wave, the next generation of crime fighters, to respond to this new generation of young people, and to kind of harness that potential of young people to affect change in their world. So a few things you might think about as we go through this novel is how does Batman define the good life? What is, for him in particular, what is an authentic life that lived? And as part of that, you might think about what changes he goes through. You might also think about his relationship with Carrie. Carrie is, to my knowledge, the first female Robin that has ever been. She's a really memorable character, and she is often kind of constructed as a soldier, that Batman talks to her as, if you do this again, I'll fire you, he says over and over again, but he never does, right? And she comes with a series of skills that he doesn't have. He doesn't understand digital technologies. He doesn't understand a lot of the things that she does, the kind of computers and those sorts of things. So his relationships with others, one of the saddest parts of the novel to me is Alfred's death. That's it's not a major character, but he's funny in the text. He's supportive, and then when he dies, that's a sad part of it. So any of these things you might think about as you go through and think about your response to the text. That's all I really have to say. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the text.